Well, good afternoon, everyone, and we're back at it after, we're two-thirds of the way through this conference. It's been a great conference. Boy, I hope you have enjoyed it as much as I have. I've been a veteran of many political conventions and so on, but this kind of a conference, this networking conference, has a different spirit about it, just a very open spirit about it, and I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. It has been wonderful. And, of course, now you are in for a real treat because we are after enjoying all that's gone on before us, we're on for a real treat here for our next speaker. I don't know how many of you have sat into these sessions and have heard one speaker after another say, I'm here because Preston Manning asked me to do this. And then you go off and you have your lunch, and the people that you're around are probably saying, I'm here because I can remember the first time I heard Preston Manning. And that's what I hear buzzing around the table. I think Preston has achieved a unique status. He's one of these guys that's actually known by single names, kind of like Shania, and a couple of those famous Madonna. And then if you say in Canadian political circles, if you say Preston is coming, that's good enough for me. I know who you're talking about. You're talking about Preston Manning. He told me to keep it short, so of course I don't know that I'll do that, but I just think over the years there's too many kind of stories and memories to really get into. But I think of the guy that when I got involved was talking about the new Canada, about a great country that could be even better if we did things right. And then after a little while he says, that's true, but now we have to think big. We have to think bigger than just our own political movement. We have to think about something that's bigger than us and bigger than the movement, and we're talking about a great new country and how to achieve it. And along the way, I don't know exactly how it all happened, but along the way, we not only were able to follow that leadership and to be inspired by it, but along the way, he kept the family spirit, so that when we talk now about getting together for a family reunion, there is no other family reunion leader that I could think of that could do that but Preston Manning. So here we are. We're two-thirds of the way through what's been a great conference already. I'm looking forward to Preston's remarks. I think that he has encouraged all Canadians to think about the country, think of what it can be, what it is, and what it can be. He's taught us and told us and modeled thinking big, thinking about not just ourselves but something more and how it can be better. And then he has given us direction in a way that has allowed him to move from the political realm to the realm of the statesman. Please join me in welcoming Preston Manning.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Well, I want to say thank you to all of you for being here and for making this conference what it is. I want to thank Chuck for his very kind introduction. Actually, most of you probably don't know this, but my lack of facility in French is really due to Chuck Straw. No, that's true, because when we first both got elected in 1993, we both went off to language school at Saint-Jean de Richelieu, south of Montreal. And, that's on an old estate. They're still looked after by Catholic nuns, and it has some of the oldest trees in Canada. In fact, they're marked as old trees, and they've got a fence around them with the date from these trees were there before Champlain came up the St. Lawrence. And when Chuck, the nuns were showing us these trees, and Chuck says, I'm a logger from BC. Vroom, vroom. And they posted a guard that night because they thought Chuck was, and we were never invited back to that language school, so I attribute that to my deficiencies there, Chuck, to your... Anyway, in the next few minutes, I'd like to speak to you about three challenges for the conservative movement in the area of ideas, training, and ethics. But before doing so, maybe I can just say a little word about the role of the conservative movement in relation to the parties. I'm very much in favor of political parties, especially conservative-oriented ones. And, there's a lot of criticism of the party system, but if you did away with them all today, they'd be recreated in one form or another within 18 months because of the majoritarian system of system government that we have. So they're an integral part of the democratic process. But our thesis is that for them to succeed and the candidates to succeed, not only in winning elections, but in governing in accordance with principles and convictions once elected, parties and their candidates need certain resources. They need a steady stream of ideas based on conservative values. They need trained people, from constituency workers and volunteers to staff to campaign managers and candidates. And they need communications channels and opportunities of all kinds. And institutions and programs outside of the parties, but sympathetic to them, which provide those resources, ideas, trained people, and communications, we refer to as conservative democratic infrastructure. And the conservative movement is the broader conservative family that includes the parties, the think tanks, the training programs, the policy centers, the interest groups, and the communications channels. And it's our view that it's the particular responsibility of the conservative movement, or the conservative family writ large, to help supply that steady stream of ideas, trained people, and communications capacity on which the success of parties and candidates depends, not just in winning elections, but in governing in accordance with those values when they get there. And our Manning Center is basically involved in raising interest and support to invest in those three areas. And this annual networking conference is our signature communications event, which seeks to get all the participants, as many as we can, of the movement together in one place in a congenial atmosphere to exchange ideas and best practices. So I want to thank each and every one of you for being part of the conservative movement and for investing your time and your money in conferences and exercises of this kind. So I want to thank Chuck for his kind introduction and for his years of public service. I want to thank all the cabinet ministers and MPs and other special guests who've given us their time over the last 2 days. We want to thank our sponsors, Amgen, AstraZeneca, Canadian Natural Resources, Shell Canada, Spectra Energy, TransCanada, and Walton Global for their support, because we couldn't do this without them. And I want to take this time, too, before we get to the end of this conference, to specifically thank those responsible for organizing the event, Darrell Reed and Vida Brody, Don Todd, Jennifer Roy and Bernice Chan, Mike Martins, and Olivier Ballou, and all the volunteers. I think we owe them a real vote of thanks. But now to the challenges facing conservatives going forward, and as I said, let me deal with three of them, starting with the challenge of in the area of ideas. What's important in the idea, I think it's important that challenging ideas get expressed and debated at events like this, because in the long run, ideas are the lifeblood of democratic discourse. And parties that become afraid of ideas, or that only entertain ideas hammered on their own anvil and forged in their own furnace, are already suffering from a hardening of the political arteries, which can be fatal in the long term. So I think it's good to debate ideas, even ones that we don't all agree with. Just even the exercise of listening to them, debating them, and sorting out the wheat from the chaff is a good exercise. Now, you've seen from the polling data presented yesterday that a majority of Canadians, and this is consistent, not just this recent poll, a majority of Canadians are losing faith or have lost faith in the idea of big government solutions to big problems. And that's good news for those of us who want governments to do a few things well, rather than attempting to do everything and succeeding in very little. You've also seen from that polling that when Canadians are asked to whom do they turn first if they have an economic or social problem or concern, that again, a majority of them mention first themselves, their family, and their community before they mention government. Again, good news to those of us that believe in encouraging self-reliance and community reliance rather than wholesale reliance on the state. So that then begs this question: what then do these Canadians expect of government? These are Canadians, after all. They're not going to be way on one end that says we want government to do everything. They won't be on the other end saying we don't want any government. Why did the Canadian cross the road? To get to the middle. And so there is going to be a role for government. Well, the pollsters asked that question too, not just this poll, but we have trends in this area. And the most frequent answer they got, and this was across all regions of the country and with both men and women, was that while people want to do things for themselves, they want government to help in some way. Sometimes by simply getting out of the way. Sometimes by leading, as in matters of personal and national security, but most often by facilitating or enabling others to get things done. That's why we're talking about this role of government as facilitator, trying to flesh it out. What does it mean? What it doesn't mean? So what does that mean? Conservatively understood and applied, it's consistent with the principles such as limited government and fiscal restraint and subsidiarity. At the provincial level, where, as you know, the three biggest area of business, if you're running a provincial government, are health, education, and social assistance. At that level, facilitating means stepping away from the old concept of the welfare state where the government assumed every responsibility for everything in that area. In other words, it means enabling other agencies in society, the NGOs, social enterprises, for-profit service companies, faith groups, communities, to perform a bigger role in social service. And this was something that Minister Finlay and Kate Bayan and Ray Pennings discussed yesterday. It means, for example, providing greater freedom of choice in education and health care, and changing the definition of charitable status and the rules of charitable giving to encourage greater personal and private investment involvement in the social sphere. The government facilitating that, but facilitating others to meet more of our social service goals. Or to further illustrate, government's facilitating economic recovery, which was the theme of Tony Clement's session this morning. That means government creating conditions where the non-governmental sector can create more jobs and create more wealth. It means, for example, keeping taxes low, reducing regulatory burden, negotiating favorable trade agreements and tax agreements with other countries, all of which the current government is doing, and which fits in very well with this facilitating role. The government doesn't directly create jobs, the government doesn't directly create wealth, but it can facilitate others to do that, and the whole name of the game in economic recovery is to facilitate as much of that as possible. Now, perhaps the biggest challenge in responding to this shift in public expectations from a do-it-for-me role to a help-me-do-it-myself role is communicating it. Often this is the challenge in all kinds of political ideas. It's not just getting a good idea, it's how to communicate it to the conservative community itself, and then, of course, to the public. Facilitating can easily be misinterpreted or misapplied as government interventions in the social and economic sectors in such a way that it entangles non-governmental entities or creates unhealthy dependencies. It can also be misinterpreted as government abandoning its legitimate responsibilities, and you can be darn sure that's how the Liberals and the NDP will interpret this concept. And politically, in a short election campaign, government as facilitator is a harder sell than government is the answer to all your problems, which is why we have had several conference sessions devoted to this subject, not just to vet the pros and cons of the government as facilitator, but to get the best minds we can addressing how would you communicate that, particularly in a short, intense election campaign. Before I leave this subject, I should share one story from my door-knocking days in Calgary Southwest, where I actually on one occasion did try to explain this concept to a voter. I had been thinking about, I didn't in those days call it the government as facilitator, I called it government as enabler. In fact, I tried to sell a provincial government about 30 years ago on running a provincial election campaign on the theme of the government that enables, as distinct from the government that tries to do anything. For some reason, I was thinking of that as I went up to this door. And a middle-aged man opened it, and perceiving that I was a candidate in the election, he asked me straight away, "What's your platform?" To which I replied, "What's yours?" And this kind of took him back a little bit. And he said, well, what do you mean? And I said, what are the 3 or 4 things that you or your family or your community or your business, if you're in business or employed, what are the 3 or 4 things you want to do or get done in the next 4 years? And I said, write them down. That's your platform. And then you should support the candidate of the party whose policies and actions you believe will best enable you to implement your platform. Now, meanwhile, my campaign manager, Harry Robinson's looking at his watch. The guy spends 15 minutes in his house. We'll never get through the 10,000 doors we got to knock on. And this pitch, of course, is not particularly appropriate if you're an opposition candidate, because you can't deliver on it. But it could be very effective if you were a government candidate. And that voter is one of the 75% of Canadians who profess to favor government in an enabling or a facilitating role. Something to think about. Government as facilitator. Is there merit in that idea? If there is, how would you sell it at the doors as well as at a conference? But now let me turn to another area where the development of conservative political infrastructure is particularly important. And I refer to the need for training to raise the knowledge and skill level of political practitioners, from constituency folks and volunteers, campaign volunteers, to political staff, to campaign managers and official agents, and to candidates for public office and even for elected officials. To work for Starbucks as a barista, you need at least 20 hours of training so that you can tell the difference between, I got to read this, tall, non-fat, one-shot mocha and a triple grande extra hot, no water chai. But you can become a lawmaker in that building over there or in your provincial legislature without 1 hour of training in making laws. That's true. That's true. The old idea was that political practitioners could learn on the job. But in this modern age of immediate demands, and nobody knows this better than the people that are in the Parliament now, nobody knows this better than your staff. In this age of instant demand and instant communication, you make one mistake, it's not just known by half a dozen people. By nightfall, it could be known by 100,000 people. This learning on the job is no longer sufficient. We need to heed the advice of the old Roman senator Cicero, who had this advice to the ambitious young politicians of his day who were desperately anxious to get into the Roman Forum. Cicero's advice was intrate peritus, enter prepared, which means get some training before you get here. Another illustration, when I was on the political speaking circuit, I was sometimes, and some of you will know this, invited to address constituency meetings held in hockey rinks. And on the way in, on occasion, I would see on the bulletin board in the entry an advertisement for the position of rink manager. They were trying to hire a rink manager. And on one occasion, I actually tore one of those things off and used it as my text for speaking to this group about the knowledge and skill levels required at the constituency level to recruit good candidates, good conservative candidates, for the election. I looked at this thing, I see you people are looking for a rink manager to run your hockey rink. I see you have a job description for the rink manager. Good for you, that's important, good to spell out the job. I can see that you've even defined what knowledge and skill the rink manager needs. Like, you've got to be able to drive and care for the Zamboni. But now tell me, where is your job description for your member of parliament? Where's your job description for the member that's going to represent you in the legislature? Where's your job description for your municipal councillor? And where's your definition of the knowledge and skill? The rink manager got to drive a Zamboni. Member of parliament, or member of the legislature, member of the municipal council's got to have some skills to do that job. Where's your list of those skills so that when you're recruiting candidates, you can tell whether that person's got them or not? And then I would end up by saying, don't tell me, please don't tell me that you have put more thought into hiring your rink manager than you have the person that's going to represent you in a parliament that's going to spend $265 billion of taxpayers' money. You know, knowledge and skill. Time doesn't permit me to describe what's being done to raise the capacity of the conservative movement to train its people at all levels. But I encourage you to check out the training sessions provided by your federal or provincial parties. And not to bypass them. Often, particularly during elections, people say we don't have to, like, they were after us all before the election, just leave us alone. But, you know, parties do try to increase the knowledge and skill level of volunteers between elections, respond to those appeals rather than turn them down. And if you can, please attend the session later this afternoon to be conducted by Darrell Reed and Mike Martins on our efforts to establish a school of practical politics that'll teach some of these kind of skills at our base in Calgary and supported by the internet. Now, thirdly, I want to turn to what I've called the ethics challenge. And you will have seen, again from the polling data presented yesterday, and under the heading of disturbing news, there was some good news in those polls, but there was some disturbing news. And that is the continued downward slide of public respect for politicians and parties. And you will have seen that this disrespect, now virtually bordering on contempt, is not so much rooted in antipathy to the policies of politicians as it is to a perceived lack of ethics. The opinion, unfair in many respects, but nevertheless real, that most politicians are unprincipled, dishonest, self-serving, and untruthful. In the public mind, this judgment is reinforced every time unethical conduct by someone in the political world makes the headlines, whether it's in the case of the sponsorship scandal years ago, or now the more recent robocall affair, to cite just two examples. And any political strategy or tactic or technology, I think all of us know this, which deliberately employs a lie to misdirect or mislead a voter is deplorable ethically, but it's also deplorable for the damage it does to the democratic process and public confidence in all parties and politicians. They don't even distinguish between who did it. Now, stricter surveillance by election officials and campaign managers may be part of the answer, but I think the more important question is how to prevent such tactics and technologies from being employed in the first place. The federal government's to be commended for the measures it put in place after the sponsorship scandal through the Public Accountability Act to try to prevent such occurrences in the future, notwithstanding the administrative difficulties. I understand it, not understanding the administrative difficulties and the danger of overkill when you react in these ways. And the federal party is to be commended for its provision of an independent accountability officer in its election war room to guard against, as best it can be done, illegal or unethical activity. But on the well-founded principle that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, I come back again to the need for better training of political practitioners. In this case, training in ethical politics, and particularly the ethical use of new political technologies, from automated voter calling to the use of social media. Almost every major science project in this country now has what they call a EEELS unit attached to the science unit, a unit that looks at monitors the economic, environmental, ethical, legal, and social implications of that science. And the reason these are attached to it, because scientists worry about the unethical use of their science and technology is a two-edged sword. This has been known this from the days of fire was invented. It can be used for good, it can be used for great things, it can be used to do damage. And that was true of everything from fire to the social media. Every business school in the country now, it teaches business ethics as a response to the Enron scandal, the WorldCom, Bernie Madoff, and so forth, that shook the confidence of the world in business. Journalism schools are now doing the same, partly in response to the involvement of media in the British phone hacking scandal. The political science departments and party campaign schools need to follow suit with explicit ethical training for political practitioners, particularly in the use of these new technologies. And voters have a right to ask, where's the ethical, legal, social unit attached to political organizations and campaigns to safeguard against the abuses of political science and political technology? On the bright side, it's encouraging to see that this newly created Riddell graduate program in political management at Carleton University, and they have a booth in the exhibition area, has incorporated an ethical dimension into every one of its core courses. And these are courses for training political staff. And we intend to do the same thing with respect to the courses taught at our School of Practical Politics. And we'd welcome suggestions as to how to make that ethical instruction effective. We need all the advice that we can get on this, because it is a difficult task. Like, there's no place in this kind of instruction for a holier-than-thou approach or for moralistic lecturing that is hypocritical and devoid of legitimate moral authority. And in this postmodern age, younger people will often ask, who gave you or anybody else the authority to tell me what constitutes ethical or unethical behavior? Yet somehow, some way, we need to reintroduce the teaching and practice of ethics into the public square. Now, in closing, changing the ethical tone of something as big and as complicated as the arena of partisan democratic politics may seem like an insurmountable challenge. But I'm encouraged in this respect by an experience that happened in my home province of Alberta many years ago, where just a few individuals, the right people in the right place at the right time, set the ethical tone for an entire industry and an entire public administration for a generation. And I tell you this story because you might well be the person to do the same thing for your party or your constituency or your organization, depending on your role in the conservative movement. The experience I refer to took place after oil was discovered just outside of Edmonton at Leduc in 1947. At that time, there was a very real danger that the provincial government, and particularly its political wing, would be corrupted by the sudden influx of oil money and the intense jockeying for drilling rights that always accompanies those kinds of discoveries. This is precisely what happened to the governing parties and the governments of half a dozen American states when oil was discovered in their territory: Texas, Louisiana, Oklahoma, California, Alaska, just to name a few. And as the oil prospectors, many of them from those oil-producing states in the U.S., came to Edmonton, most of them had only two questions: where is Leduc and who do you pay? Because that's how you got drilling rates in those states in those times. And fortunately for Alberta, two individuals with rock-solid personal integrity, one a civil servant and the other a political organizer, happened to be in the right place at the right time with the right answer. The civil servant was a man named Hubert Somerville, an official in the Department of Mines and Minerals with responsibility for petroleum at the time of Leduc. At that time, Alberta didn't have an energy department. The petroleum was just a subset of the mines department. And the other fellow was a political organizer named Orvis Kennedy, who was the president of the governing political party association and whose tasks include political fundraising. And both, when asked, who do we pay, had the same answer: if you ever offer me or any of my people a compensation or a payment such as you are suggesting, we will guarantee you one thing: that neither you nor your company will ever get drilling rights in the province of Alberta. Now, both Somerville and Kennedy could have profited handsomely from some arrangement with their oil patch suitors, but neither chose to do so. Somerville was guided by his sense of ethics as a genuinely professional civil servant. Kennedy was guided by his religious beliefs that he was ultimately accountable to God for his behavior, not just to his employer or to his community. Both died relatively poor, certainly by oil patch standards, but rich in personal integrity and reputation. But had either of them chosen at that particular point to do the unethical thing, it would have cost Alberta millions and millions of dollars, as it did cost those oil-producing states in the U.S. And that political corruption of that kind would have brought untold grief and turmoil to the politics of that province for a generation. You go study the oil-producing states where corruption got in at the front end, particularly into the political and regulatory process, and it takes a generation to root it out if you can do that. Codes of ethics, ethics commissioners, political watchdogs regulatory and accountability legislation all have their place in endeavoring to raise the ethical tone of the political arena. But if the aim is ethical politics, there is still no substitute for rock-solid personal integrity on the part of those that are involved. For Conservatives, being right must mean more than adherence to right-of-center positions. It must also mean doing the right thing. Thank you very much.